Welcome everybody to our Friday ramblings, and we are ready to start our spooky season, as I discussed last week, as we count down to Halloween the only way I know how, which is talking about everything that gets me in the Halloween spirit. And when you're talking that, folks, there is one name that you have to start with: the OG of spooky, the myth, the legend, the inspiration for pretty much everything that we know in modern entertainment. Edgar Allan Poe. This, for people that know your classic American lit, you already know Edgar Allan Poe. For those of you who don't, we're going to discuss, as soon as our spooky Halloween kitty gets out of the way here, she quits getting literally underfoot. This is what it's all about. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first American writers to really write what nowadays we would call suspense and thriller stories. Stories and poems designed to touch off some of our most primal feelings of anxiety and just fear of the unknown. Things that every horror writer and every horror filmmaker tries to get in touch with. That sense of, I have no idea what's going on, I am outside the realm of everyday reality, and from here on out, I have no clue what's going to happen, and that freaks me out. He was the original master of it. Now, this book I've had for quite a while is, as it says, Complete Tales and Poems. If you want to get into Edgar Allan Poe, find a variant of this book. Go ahead and get the complete. Because, well, it is true. I know it's really thick, but it's a lot of shorts. It's his entire career. So you can read it in small chunks very easily enough. Now, see, look at that. 29 stories just on the first page. Total of 73 stories, and they don't number it, but a few dozen poems, including some written in his youth before he really pushed, himself as a writer. Now, some of the poems are iconic. The Raven, Lenore, but personally, I love The Raven. It's got a great structure. Quote the Raven, nevermore. I mean, everybody knows that. One of the all-time great lines in poetry. I've always liked the shorts. Now, not all the shorts are straight horrors. For instance, they have a series of 3 early detective stories. And when I say early, I mean they actually preface and pre-exist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. And Doyle himself admitted to being familiar with Poe's work, and that actually helped impact the character of Holmes, as he wanted a detective that, with no disrespect to what Poe had written, was clearly not a copycat of what had been written previously. Blah, blah, blah. But you also have some adventure stories. The Adventures of the Gold Bug is a great one. It's actually the second story in this particular collection. Some crazy stuff happens in the Gold Bug, but it is not so much a supernatural story. But it still touches on mysteries and being in a situation where you don't know exactly what's going on. So it's good on that front. But as I said, we are here for the spookiness. And the reason I say to go ahead and get a complete version is because, yes, he has iconic stories. I mentioned The Raven. And, of course, there's The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, Cask of Amontillado. I'm never been 100% sure how to pronounce that. It's Italian. I've never studied Italian. Amontillado, I guess. Hey, as I've said before when I discuss manga and some of those Japanese names, if I mispronounce it, it is not a matter of disrespect. I'm simply not 100% sure. Cask of Amontillado, though, is probably on a weird me out factor the top ranked. I'm going to go ahead and give you some quick spoilers. It involves being buried alive. And specifically, being buried alive mixed with betrayal of friends and trusted ones. And that is just something that I think a lot of us in our life have been concerned about. Like, oh man, you know, I told my buddy all these secrets, you know, what if he does something bad? Because, you know, at some point in our lives we've all had that thought briefly. Well, Cask of Amontillado takes that to the limit. But, and Mask of the Red Death is another fun one too. But some of his best works are the ones that are not iconic. They're not the ones you study in high school. Let me see. It's been a couple of years since I read through this, but The Imp of the Perverse is a good one. Yes, we mentioned Telltale Heart. Let's see. The Man That Was Used Up is excellent. The Sphinx, a classic. I love Never Bet the Devil Your Head. Never Bet the Devil Your Head is more of what nowadays we would call black comedy or dark comedy. Again, depending on a particular region of the world you're in. But yeah, it is dark comedy. And as such, quite a good read. Great study on the piece of, hey, how to have somebody literally lose their head in a situation, straight up decapitation, but it come off kind of funny and well deserved. Let's see, what are some other good ones? The Spectacles is good. The Devil in the Belfry. The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym is interesting. Hop Frog, that's it. Yeah, I think Hop Frog is the other one I'm thinking of. Let me flip through here real quick and... Yes, it is Hop Frog. Hop Frog is a wonderful tale of revenge and why you should never discount anybody just because they are physically different. Yes, stories that, while they may be dated as far as cultural references go, because, you know, these stories are a few centuries old, they are very much resonating with today because Poe touched on humanity at its most primal. Now, we're going to talk real quick about Edgar Allan Poe as a person. I'm going to go ahead and set this down. Don't really need that prop anymore. We're going to talk about Edgar Allan Poe as a person. Unfortunately, Edgar Allan Poe did not make a lot of money and was not super famous as a writer during his lifetime. A lot of his infamy came after his passing. And as such, he had to pay the bills in other ways. One of those was by doing reviews of other authors' works. And a few of those reviews were, in fact, critical and negative. Which is fine. Poe was being honest. And, that's just how it goes. Sometimes you get bad reviews. As a creator, I've had to sit there and face that myself. But the problem is, after Poe died, some of those writers, since writing was really not the wide open field it is in today's time, kind of pushed to be the ones writing like biographies of the person and spread some misinformation about his life, specifically like the level of substance abuse and drinking he was prone to, which, and I'm not saying the guy was 100% straight edge sober all the time. Almost nobody was back in those days. But the level of it and the frequency of it is something that has been up for debate for many years because documentation has been questionable and contradictory. Now, yes, Poe did technically marry his cousin, but again, we have to put our modern sensibilities aside. In his time period, that was not actually necessarily an unheard of circumstance. This along with the relative age of the people involved. If you just say in modern times the phrase, hey, he married his young cousin, his like teenage cousin, that comes off really, really creepy and sleazy and illegal. And it is by modern standards, but in the culture of the time, that in and of itself was not shocking. Mostly because the key is, by marrying her, he was able to take care of her and her mother, as, back then women didn't really make their own income. And so if a woman fell ill, it was not something where she could just take her money out of the bank and her health insurance, because health insurance really wasn't a thing back then either, and go to the doctor and, just deal with it. You had to have a husband. So, it's things like this that, and I'm not just trying to justify Edgar Allan Poe's life and his decisions because he's one of my favorite authors. A lot of it is that, hold on, I'm going to do a real quick some fact checking here, folks. Yes, Edgar Allan Poe. Real quick, we're going to throw some more facts out. Was born on January 19th, 1809. Died October 7th, 1849. So he did die at 40 years old. Nowadays, that would be considered quite young. But again, back then, it was different life expectancies. It was a, respectable length of life. Is generally considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre. Again, there could be some debate made of that, as there were a couple other people tooling with the idea of the genre around that time. Further credited with contributing to the emerging genre of science fiction. Again, not the best science fiction writer in the world, but as I said before, some of his stories did touch on that. Was widely regarded as a central figure of Romanticism in the United States, which does not mean literally romantic in the way that we use the term in modern definitions of being all about love and sweetness and the positive purity of love. And I'm not making fun of love. You know, I love myself. But Romanticism in the classic sense was an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century. In most areas was at its peak in the approximate period of 1800 to 1850. Again, as a man that died by 1849, he would have been right in the middle of it. But Romanticism was characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, as well as glorification of all the past in nature, preferring the medieval rather than the classical. It was partially a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment, and the scientific rationalization of nature. Thus, Romanticism was about emotion, an intense emotion in general, whether that emotion was love, anger, fear, joy, as an authentic source of an aesthetic experience. Thus, and that is what Poe was all about, was stirring the most primal emotions in his readers, as many of his stories, besides being suspenseful and thrilling and a little bit frightening, especially the ones that do blatantly deal with the supernatural, it was also about anger and joy, and yes, there was some love in it. But let me see real quick. Yes, his spouse, Virginia Eliza Clem Poe. They were first cousins and publicly married when Virginia Clem was 13 and Poe was 27. Biographers disagree as to the nature of the couple's relationship, though the marriage was loving. Some biographers have suggested they viewed one another more like a brother and sister, and thus it was, you know, potentially not a sexual relationship. But in January of 1842, she did contract tuberculosis, slowly dying over a course of 5 years, dying from the disease at the age of 24 outside of New York City. Now, for those paying attention, yes, that means she died about 2.5 years before Edgar Allan Poe died. And thus the last, and her death, because he did love her, whether it was in more of a sibling sense or a classic married sense, her struggling with that disease for 5 years and then dying of it deeply affected Poe, and thus the poems written in his later life, during that last 7 years or so, there was a recurring motif of dying young women. Infamously, the Raven, but also Annabel Lee and Ligeia. But Poe also did serve briefly in the United States Army. So, enlisted in 1827, was discharged in 1829, so he only served 2 years. So, you know, it's a thing. It was just something people did back then. But yes. Immediately after Poe's death, his literary rival, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, wrote a slanted, high-profile obituary under a pseudonym filled with falsehoods that cast him as a lunatic and a madman, and which described him as a person who, quote, walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses, or with eyes upturned in passionate prayers. never for himself, for he felt or professed to feel that he was already damned. And this formed a lot of the public opinion of Poe for many years. As I said, a depraved, drunken, drug-addled madman. And as such, it may be one of the earliest cases in America of, well, essentially gossip and slander ruining somebody's public perception. And certainly a man that's writing about, death and supernatural, spooky things, it's going to be hard to look at his stuff and say that he wasn't a little touched in the head. But in recent decades, we have found other evidence written by other people to contradict and expose a lot of Griswold's falsehoods. And that is good for people who are fans of Edgar Allan Poe's work, because you can get a much better sense of the author behind the works. Now, what's this mean for modern spookiness? Well, as I said, the man's inspired pretty much everything of the modern era. All the great horror movie makers and writers will admit that they have read Edgar Allan Poe and many films have actually been, if they are not direct adaptations of some of his stories, clearly inspired by those stories, and thus are essentially reimaginings of the story. The man created a lot of the base concepts that Stephen King explored. Fall of the House of Usher, a lot of the creepiness of it was the feeling that you can't escape due to how isolated it was. And that the author, or not the author, but the main character was trapped in this isolated house where madness seemed to descend on him, and with that madness, the specter of death. Well, guess what, folks? That's also a pretty good basis for The Shining by Stephen King, which is one of his most popular works. Isolation, insanity, and murder. And Stephen King's never denied it. You can find interviews where Stephen King says, yes, Edgar Allan Poe was an inspiration to me. All you Bloomhouse people with your, where they're cranking out, 2-3 horror movies a year. I guarantee you those directors, those filmmakers, at some point in school, whether high school or college, read some of Edgar Allan Poe's works, and it stuck with them in their head. Because Edgar Allan Poe laid out that groundwork for those scenes where you're just walking around and it's dark, you can't see very well, but you're not alone because you can hear it. You can hear something sneaking up on you. You can hear it coming at you. And it's getting closer. And you try to run, but the faster you run, the quicker it seems to be gaining on you. Now, what is it? Well, that depends on the writer. A lot of times with Edgar Allan Poe, because again, his work was almost all psychological, well, it's just the wind. Maybe it's your echo. By the time you find that out, your mind's already left. It's out there. You're over here. Your sanity's going that way. Modern times, it's a psycho with a butcher knife. But that build up. Anytime you watch a classic slasher film from the 70s and 80s, and that build up, somebody's wandering through the house, they know the killer's in there with them, but they don't know where they're at yet. That's Edgar Allan Poe. Every time you see a modern ghost story where somebody is seeing things and hearing things and they don't know if it's in their head or if it's something out there influencing them, they know. They've got to figure it out. Or their life, it's not just a matter of their life won't ever be the same, but their life may end that night. That's Edgar Allan Poe suspense. That moment where you don't know reality from dreams. That moment where all you know is your heart is racing and your senses are ignited. And your brain is telling your body that something here is wrong and I don't know what it is yet. But if we don't figure it out soon, we're going to shut down from fear. That is Edgar Allan Poe. That is what he did. In a lot of ways he did it first. And the truth is, folks, very few people have done it better ever since. So you want to get geared up for Halloween? You want to get geared up for frights and delights and spooky supernatural adventures? Go track down some Edgar Allan Poe. The original writings. Go ahead and read. There's nothing wrong with reading. And you come back here next Friday. We're just getting started. And there's something better. Well, I don't know about better, but there's something deeper in this hole I'm digging than Edgar Allan Poe. See, he's just the surface. We're going to go deeper. We're getting into the games. We're getting into the movies. We're getting into the TV shows. And we're even going to talk about comic books. Ooh. Because it's not all fun and games superheroes. There was a time comic books were all pure horror. Keep the lights on, folks. I'm only getting scarier from here. Boom.